All right. So
It says it's live.
yes, it does. And we are, yes, and we are absolutely positively live. So I am very excited to be here today with Dr. Alaka Wali. So officially, Alaka is the curator of North American Anthropology at the Field Museum. And I guess also professionally, I was going to say personally, I just adore her. So Alaka and I met,
Thank you.
oh yeah, when I was doing my master's years ago. So we've been connected for a long time. But today I want to talk to you because we connected. I was doing looking at how to create international exhibits and things like that at O'Hare, and it had to do with how you communicate culture and how you reach out to people of different cultures at the same time. And you really look at it from almost like urban anthropology, like not just cultures looking in the past, but what does that mean today? So I am hoping, and I also understood that you studied things like the relationship between art and the capacity for social resilience. So we have
Yes, I
yeah.
do.
So we have a pandemic. We have
Right.
all kinds of wonderful social justice, Black Lives Matters going on. There's economic upheaval. How to make that connection for us? We're looking for resilience. How is it all connected, and how is this pushing us forward as a culture, as a people? Fix it for us, Alaka. Go.
Well, a lot of times I wake up in the middle of the night and I think, I should know the answers to these questions. I'm an anthropologist and this is what we do. And I don't know the answers to these questions as the sort of way that things, the confluence of events as they came together since we were hit with the pandemic. Has really been stunning. I guess, in some ways, though, I would say that looking at looking at how things have unfolded, not just recently, but over, let's say the past 10 or so years or even longer, it shouldn't be a surprise that this was the moment when these things started to erupt, so that when the pandemic hit us, right? And, we were we, meaning we in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
it's a global phenomenon, so we can talk about that as well, how other cultures or societies have been able to respond to the pandemic. When it hit, what it did was it sort of, I would say in a way, it freed people, because you had to rethink everything about your life, right? You couldn't go out, you couldn't interact with people, work was stopped, so many people lost their jobs. So it was like between the pandemic itself and the sort of fear that it caused because we're, afraid of each other now. You can't shake, you can't hug.
And I've been practicing smiling with my eyes, like when you have a
I
mask
know,
on. I'm like, you can tell I'm smiling, right?
right?
Yeah.
So that is itself, that was one thing, and then the economic upheaval was another thing, and then when the George Floyd, murder happened, how is it that there have been so many killings of Black people, right? And since the Michael Brown incident in 2014, we've become aware of them more. I mean, they've been happening forever, right? But
well, certainly with social media and on the spot camera, there's been more spreading of images of them as well.
Right, but we never had the kind of, marches in the streets across the country as we have had since the George Floyd. Why was that so distinctive? Why did it cause, what happened there that, led a massive national movement basically way.
I hope you're not asking me. That's actually rhetorical for how you're going to explain it. I can tell
Yeah,
you what I think, but hey.
I'm not asking you, I'm asking myself too, because this is the question that we ask our
Yeah.
social scientists, is like, why is this moment different from any other time? You know, what is it different and how is it different? And that's kind of like, you know, what I think we can try to understand from both a cultural and a historic perspective.
You know, I think there's an angle there too, though, because you started by saying we're all at home, we're disconnected from work. I think too that, especially for people who find their self-identity through what they do for work, you know, all of a sudden you're thinking like, well, who am I? What do I do? How do I bring value to the world? Because the way you brought value before is done. And so it strikes me that would play into it as well. If you're looking to try to make a difference or feel like you stand for something.
Right. And I think there's also an issue of generational issue, because I think the people who really started erupting into the massive protests were youth for the most part. And then folks are joining in. But, you know, and they looked at that. I'm just going to talk for a minute about the George Floyd thing, then we'll get back to the pandemic. But they looked at that video of this guy, you know, the police officer. And I think what was so different about that was that, you know, in other instances, the police have been distant from the person who they were killing, and they were shooting at that person. And it's like harder to, you know, see what the police attitude is. And in this instance, the way that the policeman, you know, looked right at the camera, and the way he, some people have characterized it as impunity. He didn't think he was ever going to get, you know, called for doing this, that he had every right to take this guy's life in this way. That's what outraged people. I think that was so visceral. You could see it in his face, and everybody just said, what? Who are we? As you say, you know, we're sitting at home thinking about who we are, we're disconnected, and this happens, and then sort of like, bam, you know, we are not that person. We are not people who just let other people get away with it.
Well, I think too, even in that instance, because certainly many people we value, I mean, we've as a society created police to protect people, and that's such an important role. And I think too, when you look at, he had, I guess, you know, the like he had supposedly passed a $20 bill, and that just seemed like it just didn't warrant the response. And I think that's where you start questioning how they got to that moment and what we as a society look to police to protect, you know, to protect us. Does that make sense?
Well, some people in society look to police to protect them. I would say that about folks in the Black community or communities of color, where the police have a long history of not protecting people. And I actually did some research on this when I worked on a project in Harlem, New York. You know, people had a very conflicted. Harlem is as you know, is an African American community in New York City, and people, on the one hand, there was an and this is a cultural thing, so from my research as an anthropologist, but that on the one hand, particularly the older members of the community, they did have high expectations of the police, that the police would protect them. You know, but what they were witnessing is that the police were not protecting them. The police were not going after the kinds of crime that worried, you know, the residents of these neighborhoods. What they were doing was going after things that at that time, things that the residents of the neighborhood felt were not crimes, you know, like small games of so like illegal gambling on the street, which is a common practice in Harlem, and it doesn't harm anybody. You know, it's numbers, and that they've been doing that for a long time. So there was a sense of like, And then when people, and the other mistrust of the police was that they weren't protected when they did inform about a crime, you know. So there was there's that kind of history of mistrust in certain communities about, for people who are supposed to be your protectors, you know, is a cultural disjuncture, if you will. You know, it is, we have to, you know, we can't just say, oh, police are there to protect everyone, because that's not been the history. And so that gets to the, you know, when I was doing that research in the 1990s, nobody even knew the term institutional racism or intersection of race and class. These were not commonly heard words. People didn't know what that meant. And then, you know, come 2016, when Donald Trump gets elected, and we're doing our in March in 2017, January, for the anti-Trump march, when everyone was wearing their, you know, pussy hats and so on. I'm giving away my political stance. That's okay. When that was happening, you saw signs that said, abolish institutional racism, you know, intersectionality matters. And I'm sitting there saying, what? You know, these are become popular terms now. And that's a cultural shift that's been happening.
Well, I think it's more
informing what's happening today.
Well, certainly. And then with both the pandemic and the economic crisis, with the pandemic, people of color were in a lot of cities, like at least 20% more likely to, sometimes it wasn't even to contract it, but if they did get it, they were more likely to die from it. And then people of color also, because of being in service in positions or things like that, were really more impacted by the economy. So you've got television, or you've got social media, which is really highlighting the institutional difference in policing, a pandemic that's affecting people of color more, and the economy that's affecting people of color more. And I think it was just so visible that there was no way, even, I'll just say it, let's say there's no way that, like, middle-aged white women, not that I would have before, but you know what I mean? There's no way that you could just look at that and be like, it's nothing, it's going to pass. Because you start realizing, like, no, it's not. Like not without people making change.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. And that, you know, that was like the thing, that there was no escaping the visibility of these disparities at this point. And the media really did sort of start highlighting it. And then you have people like Governor Cuomo in his daily briefings, you know, sort of saying, what? There's institutional racism? What is that about? Why are Black people dying? We got to find out, you know? So it became this kind of, you know, discourse in the media, in the public sphere, that had largely been academic till that point. And I think that has, you know, helped to make visible what kinds of changes we need. And what it pointed to was the fact that, you know, it's not just people of color who have been affected. It's, you know, all of us, because the healthcare system itself, though this gets back to the pandemic, is, you know, has been woefully underfunded, as everyone is saying, in, you know, in our country, in the United States. And so, like, the question of, is there a cultural reason that the United States has not been able to to fund adequately public health the way other countries have? And I think that, you know, that's another area worth investigating. And what I would say is that, you know, what you and I have talked about, what is culture, for a long time, and how do you define it? And we know, as anthropologists, we don't think of culture as just being the customs or the traditions of a people. which is what we tend to sort of stereotypically think of culture. It's not just how you dress or what foods you eat.
Mhm.
That's an important part of it. But culture is also the way people relate to each other, the processes through which social bonds are formed, you know. And so for subsets of Americans, there's different ways that that's happening, right? So, but a lot of those processes, that those kinds of social relationships, if you will, that constitute cultural practices overall, are definitely interrelated or intertwined with economic circumstances and political factors that are influencing how we all live, right? So you can't separate out cultural practices and cultural phenomenon from economic and historical and
Interesting. Well,
yeah.
I wonder too, just along this, taking that a step further, um, this idea of cultural identity. So, if anyone's ever traveled outside of the US, there are certain things you realize immediately, no matter how you identify inside the US. You go out, you're US American. It's so obvious. And then here, I think what I'm getting is this whole idea of hyphenated identities and what's now also become identity politics. I
Mhm.
found it interesting in the Wall Street Journal today, very clear that Kamala Harris, Jamaican American, Indian American, like there was this thing to really try to identify her. And where does that fit? She's also the vice president. She Look at me already saying that. Was that a slip? She's also the vice president of the United States. Um, but you know
Oh,
what I'm talking about with yeah, yeah, exactly. So, but with identity politics, it felt like because there was underrepresentation. How does it work? I can't even figure out the question. It's the idea of it started as a way to get underrepresented groups to make sure that people were being represented. Sometimes it feels like it can be used to be divisive. So what is the place of identity politics and how does that actually help move forward a more cohesive society? Or does it?
yeah, I mean, that's a really tough, nut to crack. It's hard to tease that out because,
And I
on,
could barely get the question out.
yeah, I know, but it's worth thinking through a little bit. I think we have to remember the historical story here, that a lot of the claiming of an identity,
Mhm.
aside from a sub identity, if you want to talk about that in terms of like you're African American or I'm South Asian American, whatever, um, comes about because of historically people were categorized there. They didn't choose to be that way, right? They were classified that way by the folks in power. And
Mhm.
so going back to the
Interesting. Mhm.
early days of our republic, African Americans were enslaved, and they were, that was the what was given to them as their identity, and they were, they fought that at every turn, and so people have had to struggle and resist being excluded. I think that's really, and part of how people, the strategy people used to fight exclusion was to claim, sort of to say, okay, you're excluding me, but I'm not gonna deny who I am because of the way that I've been forced to be excluded and what that has done to me, if that makes sense. And
Well,
so,
it does make sense. Actually, one thing where that makes sense too, Alika, is I think of even just sometimes like the amount of think about if you're launching a new exhibit or you're launching something even at the Field Museum, the amount of work that goes on behind the scenes, like you're growing, and then when it finally goes forward, you see everything that's on the surface. So just because one group says another group, we're not going to recognize you, it doesn't mean that group is not continuing to grow you know, they're still moving ahead and creating and achieving.
Right. And in some sense, I think you said in introducing me that I've been doing work on art and resilience, and kind of like I've been really interested in what are the sources of resilience? Where does when people have resilience is a quality that is there because it's a way we cope with adversity, right? When we talk about resilience, it's because we're saying people have faced adversity and they've coped with adversity, and that's what's made them resilient. It's just inherent in the definition of the word. You bounce back from disaster, right? From adversity. And so where does that capacity come from, especially for people who have been beaten down for centuries? So, I started looking at that with indigenous peoples in the Amazon initially because I was doing work there and in urban Chicago. And, it's a really, it's a really interesting thing that folks who have historically faced oppression seem to have a really strong capacity for resilience.
And was there a commonality among different cultures or groups that led to resilience? Or is there anything that you learned that could help people today? Because we're at a time where we really need some resilience. We're in a big time of change.
Right. Right.
And not only resilience, I don't know if this is implied in resilience, it's important for people to maintain a positive attitude that we can figure it out. Some people are like, that's it, we're done. I don't want to think that. I like to think that we can figure it out, but what is culture? Is there something in the cultural studies you've done that teach us that? Because I will say, you said in an article, the critical importance of cultural diversity for the survival of all life on Earth. Do you remember saying that?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I'm giving you all the hard ones. I'm back to you fixing the world for us, Alaka. Tell us.
No, I'm not going to fix it, but I am going to say that the people that one thing to think about how to, as you say, gain a better capacity is to learn the lessons from folks who have been, suffered so much.
Oh, interesting. Sure.
How have they done it? How have they overcome or continue to overcome? They haven't overcome completely because they're still suffering, but how they cope with it and survived. And so when I now work with the Native Americans, what I hear is from them is what they want us to tell their story in the Field Museum is the story of we are still here. We have survived your attempts. You white settlers, you folks who founded this country that was our land, right? You thought you could get rid of us in a systematic way, but we are still here.
Especially with that Supreme Court case the other day where half of Oklahoma has been recognized now as native land.
Yeah, they fought hard for that, and they're continuing to fight. But it's not just the legal; it's the cultural battle. It's the ability to say, "I am, I am Native American, and here are the roots of my, identity." As we were talking about it, the reason that and indigenous people in the Amazon similarly have suffered tremendously because, after the conquistadores came and wiped out, literally millions of native peoples in that South America, they're there. They've held on. And part of it is the ability to transmit across generations a different worldview, a different way of thinking about the world. And that is why I think difference is critical, because if we can understand that their way of thinking about the world has value and not think of it as something that they should have to assimilate to a larger, value structure that's, that in our case now, the kind of dominant value structure is consumerism. We're all supposed to be good little consumers and, buy. That's what we're relentlessly being pushed to do culturally. But here's a value system and a way of thinking about the world that's not about consumption. And that's what I found with artists too in Chicago. They're not interested in consuming, they're interested in generating, using their creativity to create music, art. You know, that's a really different way of thinking about the world. If we can learn from that, what that capacity is it allows you to then confront adversity, I think. This is just theory.
I think too, well, it's not just your theory, Alka. You do this at the museum because it ties into the idea too. You know, you hear the cancel culture. We're just going to change because the history wasn't represented well. So we want to rewrite from multiple perspectives. But from what you just said about your work with indigenous groups or cultures at the museum, that's what you have to do. You have to convey the history and the current reality at the same time. So that's it sounds really hard, but it sounds fascinating to do that in a way that everybody says wow and learns.
Yeah, and can learn from it and can value diversity and different ways of thinking, because, you know, if we all have to buy into, you know, the national whatever it is, you know, and it's global, it's not even just national, it's like global, you know, based on an economic system that depends on consumerism, right? It depends on that. It depends on all of us extracting things from the earth so that we can have bigger houses and bigger TVs and so on. We're doomed as a people, as a human species. So we really need to rethink a lot of these things and figure out a way that allows us to, you know, have a good quality of life, have a quality of life that, you know, is satisfying and so on, but you know, sees value in friendship and rituals and, you know, conversation, in art. And these are the kinds of values that I think we can learn from people who were discriminated against and experienced suffering, but held on to those values for themselves, you know. So that's, I think, what I'm trying to figure out. And how is the pandemic and the current moment, what is that revealing to us as to how we can do that? How can we value diversity?
Well, it certainly sounds like it's completely lift the shade. Like if anyone had a shade, it's lifted the shade so that more people, not only within the U.S., but even just the support of global demonstrations around the world. Everyone's saying it's enough that we want to be heard.
Creative solutions, creative responses to the pandemic are happening in Africa. They're happening in Asia. You know, we should look to those responses. You know, we should look to what people are doing in their communities and other countries that we typically don't pay attention to, and learn from that. Learn from those places and what people are doing. Yeah.
So interesting. What you just said is a direct overlay to diversity, equity, inclusion, because studies show that time and again, diverse teams will outperform homogenous teams. And that's usually about team building for some business or work related issue. But that is interesting if you look at a global committee of people with just different ideas and approaches to how you solve something that's impacting the whole world.
Yeah. Right.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. So I had you come today. I told you it's intercultural talk. So it's intercultural, intergenerational things, and I always like to see how it plays out in daily life. Things that I look at are the idea of listen for content over how someone says something, listen for your own style, as well as not just always looking at someone else's. So self-awareness and being uncomfortable are some things that I think are good for people to have in their toolkit to approach the world through an intercultural lens. What would you add if somebody wanted to put something in their toolkit? What would you add to that list?
Well, just being open-minded, I guess, you know, that sounds like a cliche, but to really be able to listen. That's what I learned as an anthropologist to other people's experiences and other people's stories and be able to appreciate that. You know, everybody often ends up saying, oh, we're all the same. We can all get along because we're the same. And not enough attention paid to valuing listening to different stories and what they can tell you about yourself, you know, making that connection between your story and someone else's story in that deeply meaningful way. So,
yeah, I love that. It's so true. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to and tuned in live with us. This will now live on Facebook Live and YouTube. So please, if you're on YouTube, hit subscribe. Facebook, please feel free to send any questions ahead of time. And Alaka, as always, so grateful for you, for all of your knowledge, for all that you bring, and just for our longtime friendship. It's so meaningful to me. So thank you.
Thank you, Deanna, and congratulations for all the great work you're doing. I really admire how you've taken those lessons that we've worked on together and applied them to this work that you're doing and helping your clients really have a deeper experience and attain better success as a result of paying attention to intercultural talk. So thank you. I'm proud of you.
Thank you. Thanks, Alaka.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye. You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.